Foreshortening is when elements that are in front of you point more actively in your direction than normal. So if I took a ruler, kind of broadside like this, and I put it in that orientation, that would be a foreshortened ruler. Take your cast and turn it in such a manner so that it's really facing at you, because this way we can deal with some of the strategies and the mysteries of trying to figure this stuff out. So there are all sorts of ways that artists interpreting what's going on, and that's one of the reasons why we find ourselves within this forum talking so actively and avidly about what some of those means are. I'm working on a piece of 18 by 24 Strathmore. Now this is not the smooth Strathmore. This is the Strathmore with a tiny amount of friction to it, or tooth, and I like that myself. I like the resistance on the paper because it catches the material a little bit more successfully. I lay out the graphite and I feel like the graphite sticks better than it would to a plate surface. And you have to get acclimated to a kind of texture that you like so that you can engage in an activity that you really love to engage in. One of the best ways to learn that is to go into sketchbooking and to try different papers. So there's already a couple things that we've talked about here that could be useful to you. The paper itself, the pencil grade, the kneaded eraser, the plumb line, and now when I talk about the paper not being padded, what I mean by that is when you put the paper down on the page, you want to also decide whether or not you need several sheets, because if you hear that, there's a crispness to the paper. I'm not padding the paper this evening. In some cases you want several different sheets because your mark melts into the paper a little bit differently as you lay out the graphite passage. This goes to the feel again, the art of the touch and what you respond to as an artist. Some people would not respond to multiple sheets because there's a sense of a kind of cushioning that you're drawing into. And I sometimes use it and I sometimes don't. As I put in my first mark, when I look at my cast in foreshortening, I kind of identify with an initial axis, a kind of activity mark, a diagonal typically. It's almost always a diagonal for me. And I want that diagonal to set the agenda, to sort of make me think about this broad activity, this striking graphic activity that I feel like everything aspires to, and at least my strategy wants to record, or at least take a stand on. Once I get into that, I can kind of build the perimeter around that activity, around that notion of how it will begin, which is something that I really want to explore because I just find it so incredibly interesting to think about the way that you could siphon down all this information, because there's got to be 10,000 decisions in drawing a cast of a hand, but how could you boil them down into an essence? And the essence to me is the active axis or active line of action, or dominant diagonal, as my teacher Myron Barnstone used to call it. I see dominant diagonals all over the place. I always have. It might be some weird affectation that I walk around with that I probably shouldn't admit while I'm being recorded. However, I don't really care. It's part of how the art practice changes you. Once I go in and define that, I try to build around that. So this marker here is intending to be on the photograph the wrist, right around the ulna bone. This marker here is intending to be the back of the hand. This marker will be the stand-in mark for the pinky finger, and this will be something which generally aspires to link up the index finger with the mark of the thumb. And then I'm going to take a step back and see if I'm out of my mind. I may well be, however, the drawing appears to be going in kind of sort of the right direction. This idea of how the entire hand is pointed out to a marker, to a moment. And you want to be very mindful of that. This notion of taking the finger or taking the body part and pointing it means that you can take advantage of longer lyrical marks that might pass through your figure or your limb, as the case may be. Those are really great because they're going to give you some kind of expressive advantage in the way that you orchestrate the initial drawing. Next thing on my mind is the idea that as I break into these, and you can see I draw with straights, I describe them as just simple 2x4s that build the drawing like a house or like a building, and I believe in that, and I use it all the time. But what I really love about these lines is that they're so kind of expendable. I don't have any commitment, and I want you to have that same exuberance, that thrill of building a drawing system for yourself where you're not committed to anything. It's like shuffling a deck, and you shuffle this from here over to here or up to there, and once you change a single major line of this relationship, by definition you change the whole relationship. So you're looking for that to animate the way that you orchestrate the drawing, because as you stand back away from the drawing and look at it over time, that relationship will go through these phases of development which will interest you. When I consider the relationship, I want that mark right there to be read from this side as well as from that side. If you only read the mark from the interior, your thinking will go to the familiar too soon. And when things start to go wrong, you default to drawing a hand. And I don't want you to have to draw a hand and to flesh out the details until you're good and ready. So part of capturing the optical is to invite this additional perimeter. And part of it will also be to invite what I have behind this cast, which happens to be a couple of boxes of lead white. This environment around your subject matter can be incredibly useful because it's the natural visual grid that you'll be able to utilize as you draw. This is the tabletop, the shadow shape, and now you have another perimeter around the main perimeter, around the contour, so to speak. I begin to tinker with it. Maybe the marker that I had for the index finger should be restated. This is what I have described in the recent tutorial as the what if stage, where I said, what if I move this over? What happens to this overall sense of equilibrium, the visual weight? So the way the equilibrium will work in a drawing like this is you're going to have weight visually go this direction. It kind of sweeps through. As you identify this passageway, these shifting markers can accommodate the feel of the weight going through the image, and I think that's a really big deal. It gives you more of a natural sense. It'll keep your drawings and your paintings and your sculptures feeling more alive if you continue to hold on to the importance of gesture as something more than a simple task, the life or liveliness of the drawing. I made a pivot change to that index finger angle, and I think that's going to work better. Are you noticing that as I put this together, I've got an opportunity to pull that line? When I say pull that line, I mean take that line and manipulate that line so that it's going up in this direction, which is kind of neat. In some ways, that's like a measuring line. So each and every one of these pieces of the design that will become the hand later has the capacity to point and to connect. And what I tend to do is I get more preoccupied with the straight connector. But every one of those lines is extended. The drawing kind of completes itself. It has to run into different components of itself, different aspects of itself. It makes a lot of sense. But it's always surprising situationally when you see it happen. For every curve that I think I'm picking up on, there's got to be an underlying character to the curve that can be defined by angular relationships. And so this could easily be a curve defined by a point of amplitude or inflection. And that, to me, would be the construct of the curve. You see, like the architecture of the curve would begin here, expand to there, and then drop to here, and so on and so forth. So I very much like the idea of this almost utilitarian manner of constructing the curve. I continue to wonder about gesture in particular, and that liveliness and the way that the sort of vitality permeates people in pose. It's one of the reasons why we go back to the figure again and again to draw that essence of the body in pose. It's just captivating. And to put that into the beginning as though it's the easy part, the basic part, and if you're not very sophisticated, you do short pose, I think is a big mistake. We've seen this phenomenon before, all of us, where we get into a life drawing situation, or even if we reflect on the first one we went to or the first several, there were things that we knew and there were many things we didn't know, and we kind of ran out of things to do in 20 minutes. I know we've all been there. You sit at the horse, the drawing horse, or the easel, and you're like, what do I do for the next 16 and a half minutes? That's what I got. That's all I got. Then you get to studying, and at some point you realize, oh my God, I've got way too much on my plate. I could never possibly get to everything I want to in 20 minutes. And so how do you go into that situation and innovate? Because you've got to find some kind of responsive way that makes you believe that this is the right kind of practice for you, and it delivers every time as well. That's the other thing. You got to get consistency so that your starts always have this attribute that you can build upon. We're all after that, I think, no matter how we draw. There's an enclosure, and the implication of this is that these markers here and here, they sweep under. So when we start talking about foreshortening, there's a great concept in that. You're pointing into a principle of foreshortening already by the way you orchestrate the big wrist element. My initial statement suggests to me that there's a sufficient amount of editing and simple drawing in here. Make sure that when you begin analyzing the overall, I'm going to say height, you don't measure on a diagonal. Even though you may think that it's easy to repeat, I just try to put in the diagonal related to vertical or related to horizontal. Measure if you have to on a vertical or on a horizontal. I'm going to make sure that the width accommodates the height. The idea here is the priority of the height makes the width move. When an argument breaks out between these four people, top, bottom, right, and left, the people that win the argument are top and bottom, and the ones that lose the argument are left and right. If I take the entire cast and I lay it out like this, and an argument breaks out between right, left, top, and bottom, in this case, right and left win the argument, because this is the bigger axis. This is the bigger dimension here. I would call this width. But I want to make sure that all that is underscored, and I think it made sense. At least I hope it did. Whatever you want to call this phase, assessment phase, everybody's got to have some natural assessment phase to figure out what's working and what isn't. Some people use head lengths, like 8 heads and all that kind of stuff. Other people use mirrors, which I support. The idea of lifting the middle of the sort of division here between bottom and top, the idea of raising that means I don't have to screw up a lot of the other lines. I just kind of elevate that central mark, and I'll work off of that central mark now as a matter of directing the information. So now that I have that positioned, I made another mark here to restate where the thumb is going to go, where this drawing line is going to go, and then I took out the old mark. I call this a transfer. When you put in a transfer mark, you're actually redrawing before you erase. The plumb line is going to be another great tool for us. I've got some questions continually about that angle right in through there and how it's going to read. I already mentioned the equilibrium. However, I also want to be mindful of the relationship down in through here to the stuff that's upstairs. I'm just going to take that marker and apply its relationship vertically to what I see above and see where it takes me. And sometimes I have to employ this technical language. I don't want it to make the drawing experience feel banal or overly painful for you. I just want to be clear. To me, that makes more sense out of what's going on between these two areas. Again, I'm talking about this outermost moment. I don't want to be redundant and say point, but there's a marker right there, and its relationship to a marker down through here as a general guide for improving the image, improving the relationships of the major components within the image. This could be a definitive mark you could also use. These are all very conspicuously straight and architectural, and this is not. And I was saying, why might you want to employ an arc like that? And the reason would be that there's a gracefulness to this ring finger. The way that it sits, the way that it hangs, the way that it collects itself, it seems to drop in and give you a real sense of lyricism in the form. I want it to be really clear that not only is this angle different than that angle right there, so I've got this one and that one, but there's also, speaking of conspicuous, there's a very clear looking triangle down and through here that allows at least the initial sense of this overall graceful form to hang like a piece of drapery. There's a kind of lift on the index finger and a sort of drop on the ring finger. This is analogous to you're late to class and the only spot that's remaining is the one right in front of the model, and so you wind up drawing toes pointed directly at you. You get stuff like that where you have to kind of just use straight up plumb line this way and that way to establish how things are positioned. The form itself looks rather short to me, but that's what happens in foreshortening. You wind up with these areas, they look kind of stumpy. They look like they're too thick. You want to be looking at that, you want to be looking at this, and maybe asking yourself, how do I figure out a way to make it look more believable? And one of the ways that you can go after that is to add the beginning of some sort of marker to note where the forearm can conclude or end up. You can illustrate various, let's say, landmarks to redesignate spaces, areas inside of the subject matter. And so one of my spaces and areas is going to have to do with this particular part here, where I'm saying, if I initiate that angle right there, isn't it interesting to see that angle lift up well above the halfway marker? So it's going way up here. That gives me some kind of insight on the amount of pivot on the overall hand that I may either be capturing or missing, as the case may be. You get stuff like that in foreshortening again. It's surprising because your perspective is so unusual.